This Newsmaker Saturday starts now.
Thanks for joining us. Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation is over. The principal finding, no evidence that the president or anyone else within government colluded with Russia to subvert the 2016 election. And the Attorney General found no evidence to support that the president or anyone else in his administration obstructed justice. But for 2 years, some of the leading voices in American media reported that proof was mounting. The president was, in essence, a tool of the Russian government, an act of treason if true. How did the media get it so wrong for so long? And what are the lessons for journalism going forward? Well, let's get started. Walter Robinson. He's reported for the Boston Globe for 34 years, led the investigation that uncovered the Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal for which he won a Pulitzer Prize. He's been a city editor, metro editor, White House correspondent, foreign correspondent, currently visiting professor in investigative journalism at ASU at the Cronkite School. That's where I went, so we've got a connection. Mi-Ai Parrish is the former president of USA Today Network, publisher of the Arizona Republic, and Mi-Ai is a faculty chair at Arizona State University. Great to see you both. Appreciate you coming down.
Good to be here.
This, to me, is the question of our time in journalism, is fairness, balance. Let me start with you, Walter. Do you think that this whole experience, Russia investigation, Mueller's findings, is it time to kind of hit a pause and say, journalists need to reflect on what they're doing and how they're doing it?
There's always reason on any big story for journalists to pause and think, and clearly we don't do it enough. There's been a lot of pausing and thinking over the last 2 years about the coverage and whether it's fair. And certainly this is a point at which that's appropriate. But it's also the case that the Mueller report isn't out yet. And
True.
We don't know what's in it. And one thing that's true, it is a fact that there have been voices in the larger media who have suggested that there was a conspiracy and that the president was a tool of President Putin or a spy for the Russians. I don't know of any credible news organization that advanced that theory. I mean, that's something you heard a lot from Rachel Maddow on cable television news.
You are drawing the line right now between, when we talk about the media, what was going on in actual reportage versus opinion stuff that was on cable news.
Absolutely, and
sure.
I'm a
No, go ahead.
No, I agree.
I'm a Washington political junkie. I spent
Right.
7 years there, covered 2 White Houses, and I pay particular attention, and particularly to the investigative reporting about this issue by major news organizations. And it doesn't matter what the Mueller report says, that reporting, the vast majority of it, is rock solid and is verifiable.
Mi-Ai, do you worry that the media got a black eye over this? That had it turned out that there was obstruction, and we still don't know, there could be some case to be made that Mueller was walking a line and leaving it to Congress to figure out on obstruction. But do you worry that going forward, some of this undercuts what we were hearing for 2 years?
I think there's been so much acceleration in the news cycle that it has made that pause that you talk about really difficult, right? You know, it just piles on and piles on and piles on.
You can't
and
stop to think about what you're doing and why.
The cadence of it is incredible, and it's coming from so many different directions, and it's so unmooring for the way that we've been trained to approach journalism. And I think that there has been damage that is very hard to undo. I don't believe in like a deliberate conspiracy of people. I mean, there are very good journalists doing rock solid journalism, but the speed of that and the pressures of that have made it really difficult when attacks have been made against the press or against media in general.
Fake news. You
know, when you said fake news, and you know, the vast majority of things that have been called fake news are not in any way fake, but you spend all this time trying to say it's not fake, and then you know you get caught in this maw of a really damaging cycle that we haven't figured out how to hit that reset button.
Walter, how does a newsroom provide balance when 80-some% of journalists self-identify as being either liberal or left-leaning? How do you strike a balance in coverage if the very people covering the news have a particular orientation?
Well, it depends which news organization you go to. If you find that kind of a split, you're more likely to find it on the two coasts than in the middle of the country, and
right.
that's a fact. But look,
which is where the networks are headquartered.
Right.
Right.
But we all, as you mentioned earlier, we all have our biases, and we need to learn how to set them aside when we're approaching a story, and make sure that, as I like to say, we go down the middle of the road and we shoot out windows on both sides. And, you know, there's
and ask questions later?
And, well, no. Along the way, we're asking the questions. But,
right.
But, you know, there's a reason why editors get paid more than reporters, and that's to make sure the reporters are doing their jobs, that the stories they're producing are fair and balanced, and that, and this is something that we do in investigative reporting a lot, is that we look at every story we're doing well before publication, and we challenge ourselves. How do we know this is true? What would the person we're writing about say about this? Do we know that the data we have is correct? Can we make an absolute ironclad conclusion about the facts? And we go through that process very carefully. Now, we have time to do that, whereas a lot of what we're talking about are stories that break during a day, during a news cycle that now seems to last, the average news cycle, about 3 hours.
And the pundits come on, and you start getting a lot of opinion from, frankly, a lot of political operatives on both sides who are spewing out kind of a company line, right? I mean, this is what happens. So you're saying that the speed of what we're expected to do in the particular time frame is almost untenable to try to get, at times, really thorough.
Absolutely. I mean, if everybody...
reporting and reflection.
Right, and you have a lot of people, you know, Twitter has accelerated this, right? Social media has really amplified this in a way that isn't healthy, and it's really difficult for the journalists, right? So when Robbie says there's a 3-hour news cycle, I mean, sometimes you have like a 30-minute news cycle, and then you're like, wait, I missed. I mean, I'm on a plane for 4 hours without Wi-Fi, and I missed like 9 stories.
No kidding. And in the Trump administration, things come fast and furious.
Right. And it's very purposeful, you know, and it isn't the way that we're used to doing the work. So the kind of work that Robbie's talking about, you know, where you spend months and months and months fact-checking and verifying and doubling down, you don't do that in that kind of space in the political environment that we're in right now.
Let me read something to you. I want to get both your reaction. This is from Rich Lowry, National Review. He says, the media coverage of the Russia investigation was abysmal and self-discrediting, obsessive and hysterical, often suggesting that the smoking gun was right around the corner, sometimes supporting its hoped-for result with erroneous, too-good-to-check reporting. Never has so little come of so many screaming chyrons. It's really a shot more at television maybe than print, but how do you react to that when you hear that?
Well, that's a shot at cable television news. And Rich Lowry's been wrong most of the time on this, and he's very wrong on this. That he knows, as well as many of his fellow conservatives who really can't stand Trump. It's not a question of liberals. There's a lot of conservative angst, conservative media angst about Trump, that he knows that the vast bulk of the reporting about Trump and his White House is spot on. I think what he's, in a way, complaining about, that we're complaining about, is the way good reporting gets amplified and distorted in the cable news bubble.
Okay, that's interesting. You're saying a good piece of reporting then is interpreted by the talking heads, and it can be completely misshapen by the time it comes out on the other end.
Well, Rachel Maddow is a great example of this, because she will take an item in the day's news that is verified, that's fully reported, that everybody accepts as true, and she'll spin it out on her hour. And I think she's now eclipsed Sean Hannity in ratings in the evening. And she'll spin it as being some vast conspiracy by Trump and the Russians. And she's been doing this for 2 years now. So that's the kind of thing that when you lump us all together, we all end up getting discredited.
And okay, Mia, I want to get your take on this. Just from a viewer reaction and as a news executive, I want to go to tape number 9, if we can. This is Jim Acosta in a pretty terse exchange with the President of the United States in the White House. And I just want to get your take. Let's take a look at this and get your take on whether this is productive or not.
If I may ask one other question, Mr. President, if I may ask one other question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's
Mr.
enough.
President,
That's
I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr. President,
that's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other
Peter,
question,
let's
if
go.
I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have?
I'm not concerned about anything with
you
the
may have
Russian
indictments coming
investigation
down?
because it's a hoax.
Are you-
That's enough. Put down the mic.
Mr. President, are you worried about indictments coming down in this investigation?
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN. Go ahead.
I think that's unfair.
You're a very rude person. The way you treat Sarah Huckabee is horrible. And the way you treat other people are horrible. You shouldn't treat people that way. Go ahead.
I think we crossed the Rubicon on that exchange. I've never, I mean, even rather when he was pressing Richard Nixon during Watergate, that was pretty ugly, but nothing like that. I was just sitting back watching that morning and I thought, what in the world is going on? How did you read it?
You know, I think we have allowed ourselves, we talk to our students, and when we were in newsrooms, you know, we talk about keeping the high ground, you know, and being balanced, being not part of the story, right? And something like that, you become part of the story. You become the thing that's covered, and you never want to be in that space. You never want to be in that place. And it has become so much more the norm, and that's a dangerous place, not just for television, right? You know, that's,
I mean, it does look to the average viewer, and that's his audience.
It makes it-
CNN, it looks like advocacy. I am here with one job, to bring this guy down. That's what it looks like.
You know,
You've been there. You've been in that briefing
I don't
room.
like either side of what happened in that exchange, right? You know, that's not acceptable. But that
wouldn't go over real well in a newsroom, frankly.
Oh,
I mean,
no.
newsrooms are
Absolutely
rough and
not.
tumble places, but if you
Absolutely
had
not.
this kind of thing, it would make everybody pretty uncomfortable.
right.
Acosta is probably my least favorite White House television reporter because of his mannerism. I probably, I don't know, scores of presidential news conferences that I covered, and the one standard that everybody observed, and I think it's gone missing for some reporting, is the respect you have to have for the office of the president. And that means if you're asking a tough question, you ask it in a polite
Respectfully.
manner. And we should do that in all of our journalism.
Right.
But to get into a shouting match with the President of the United States does no one any good.
Right.
And particularly
worse.
those of us in the news who really believe in getting it right and being fair. That kind of behavior by a network reporter, it's not acceptable.
We've got to take a break here on Newsmaker Saturday. Pleased to have Walter Robbie Robinson from the Boston Globe. He's a professor at ASU. Mi-Ai Parrish, former president of USA Today Network and publisher of the Arizona Republic. And we're back in a moment. Discussion about journalism in the wake of Trump and the Mueller report most recently. Back on Newsmaker Saturday in a moment. Back on Newsmaker Saturday, discussing journalism in the era of Trump and in the wake of the Mueller report that we still have not seen in its entirety. Mi-Ai Parrish is the faculty chair at Arizona State University. She formerly was the president of USA Today Network. And Robbie Robinson, Boston Globe for 35 years, right? Broke the Catholic abuse scandal. Pulitzer for that. We're very happy to have you both here. Something that crossed my mind this year, and I've mentioned this to folks in the newsroom and in my orbit. When it comes to presidential debates next year, I think we're on a very short list of who could possibly be drawn, who would be acceptable to both sides. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's become
Who's left standing? Who hasn't revealed their bias and their cards?
It's become really exhausting to see this kind of divisiveness and where people feel like they have to divide in order to be heard. You know, so you have to say the more and more and more outrageous thing, and the more and more and more opinionated thing. Instead of, okay, let's talk about what the facts are, people aren't going to just listen to that. So you have come to a place, and I think frankly some of the journalists are exhausted, right? You're in this maw and you're covering it and covering it, and you just start to show your exhaustion, your aggravation, your, without compunction, which we used to be able to like breathe and just take it home and drop it there instead of showing it on camera.
Robbie, you've been doing this a long time. Have you seen this change? Have you seen what we do fundamentally change? Or is the basics of reporting still right as it was when you got in?
Well, obviously, the most mainstream news outlets have suffered huge economic decline because of what's happened with the internet. So we have fewer journalists with the same demands upon them and demands to produce for the web all day long.
Yeah.
And so the pressure on journalism and frankly, the chance that things won't be right has increased. And, good editors do their best to try and prevent that from happening, but it's a fact. I mean, we have, in national reporting, we actually have much more investigative reporting going on in Washington now than has ever been the case.
In sheer numbers.
In sheer numbers.
Right.
And
huge teams.
Because the quality is good.
And by news organizations that have invested substantial resources. Let me give you one example. The New York Times, which used to have 2 reporters covering the White House, has 7.
Is that because of Trump?
Oh, yeah.
Because of Trump, mostly because of Trump. He is I have to say, and forgive me
for saying, good for the biz.
Forgive me for saying this. If Hillary Clinton had been elected president, most of the reporters now covering the White House would want to be covering agriculture in Kansas. because her White House, and I want to make a serious point here, her White House would have leaked, but only, like the Obama White House, only authorized leaks. And the reporters, the good thing about the Obama White House for reporters is that everybody leaks, and very little of it is authorized.
Now, on the Trump side, and this is something I give him great credit for, access. I can't remember ever a president who was so accessible to the press. He's out there all the time talking. He's out when he goes to Air Force One. He's out there when he goes to Marine One. Right. He talks all the time.
Talking to the enemies of the people. I mean, does he really believe that? I'll tell you a story. During the campaign, at one point, his campaign put the Washington Post on a list of news organizations that he would not deal with. That very same week, he was sitting in New York with reporters from the Post who were writing a book about him.
There you go.
So that's Donald Trump.
Mi-Ai, in a newsroom, and you hired a lot of folks. We talked earlier about, most journalists self-identify as liberal or left-leaning. Would you try, when you were hiring, to say, conservative voice here, I can see it, I can tell, they made it pretty clear, I want that brain in my newsroom?
Absolutely.
Just to provide another perspective.
We talk about diversity, and a lot of people think that is just more women or more people of color, and I really feel like it is those things, but it also is a diversity of thought and a diversity of background. And you can never assume that you know somebody's story, but we need people with diverse stories and diverse backgrounds.
And that goes for editors too.
Absolutely.
Who are fact-checking.
So you have people who understand the communities that they cover in a more nuanced way and understand the politics of the time in a more nuanced way. And have all different beliefs, religious beliefs, whether they're an immigrant, whether they're bilingual. I mean, all of the things that are, you need that, and you certainly need that in the environment today where we have people with more conservative backgrounds and points of view. I think it's really important.
Let's talk about social media for a minute. The people who pay our bills as journalists want us to put stuff out there on Twitter and Facebook.
Right.
But in doing so, it's inevitable that you're going to reveal your sensibilities about politics, the world, whatever it may be. Is this a trap that we've set for ourselves?
So we have really serious standards and codes of ethics around social media. The big media companies all do. Gannett does, McClatchy does, all of the news programs do, about what anyone who works at that organization is supposed to be saying on social media. I mean, you sign a paper that says, you know, I will not engage in this. I do not represent. You know, I won't if I'm representing. But it happens a lot, right? And and there are reasons that those standards are in place, that those codes of ethics are in place, because it's detrimental to the media that, you know, Robbie talked about being not monolithic, right? It's detrimental to the craft and to the industry.
Do you think consumers now are savvy enough to figure this all out? I get a sense, I've always given the public tremendous credit in their ability to figure out who's real, who's not, who's driving an agenda. I think the consumer is savvier than ever. Am I wrong about this?
I'd like to think that's the case. The evidence contradicts that.
There's research around it.
There's research around. I mean, the percentage of people in the United States who can't name their own congressman is approaching 70%.
Has that always been the case, or is this a new thing?
The numbers have been creeping up.
Yes.
Despite all the information we've got at our fingertips, I mean, you can now Google that and find the answer very quickly.
But most people don't. Let me I'll give you one example. I hang around back in Massachusetts with some pretty savvy people, not journalists, people who are well educated, been in business, and they'll come up to me and they'll say, you know, the New York Times is biased against Trump because they just did a story that did such and so. And I say to them, did you read the story? And most of the time, they haven't read the story.
They saw the headline.
They saw it on Fox News.
Ah.
So,
or they read the headline and just said, I'm not reading any further. Right, I know what this is about.
So too many people get news that's literally third or fourth hand and has been twisted to the extent that it fits their bias and they accept it.
Did you, when Brian Ross reported that President Trump had told General Flynn to contact the Russians during the presidential campaign, that was a big mistake. Brian Ross has done some amazing work in his career. That was a big one. Were you shocked that something of that magnitude was misreported?
I was not, partly because of the deadline pressures and
but boy, Brian Ross got a team of people. He's got a lot of resources.
Yeah, I would say less shocked. I don't want to say anything bad about Brian Ross. I was less shocked that it was him than if it had been somebody from another network.
We've got a minute left. I want to give you each a thought about, kind of a final thought about this. Mia, do you think that journalism is in a better place than it was 2 years ago before Donald Trump, or in a worse place?
I think it's in a really different place. I think the trust and credibility issue is unbelievably worse.
Is it being discussed at Cronkite?
It is being discussed. It's a huge part of what we do. It's a huge concern. It's a huge thing that we need to deal with going forward. And then in some other ways, I think we've never seen such a time where people need and are engaged in and are longing for quality, credible news.
Robbie, last word, 15 seconds. Where are we here?
I think I agree with Mia. I have to say that I think big percentage of the American public understands more than they have in a long time how important it is to have good reporting, and they're supporting it finally, and they damn well ought to be.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank
and
you,
proud
Sean.
that you're at ASU. It's incredible the resources they're pulling in over there. Go Devils. We're back in a moment on Newsmaker Saturday. Thank you both. Thanks again to Mi-Ai Parrish and Robbie Robinson for joining us on a great discussion about the state of journalism. You can reach me at Facebook, John Hook Fox 10, on Twitter, John Hook Fox 10. Look forward to seeing you next week on Newsmaker Saturday.